In this video, we're going to learn the difference between layouts and views. We've been using views in most of the other videos, and layouts a little bit too, though we haven't really spent much time investigating them directly. Views are directly connected to the handlers we've been discussing. When a handler runs, like our users.list for example, there's a corresponding users list view that handles the UI for anything specific to that handler. Let's take a look at the UI for that now. Here's our list.cfm file. This is the view that hooks up to the users list function right over here in our users handler, users list. And you can see here is our users list CFM file for the view. So the views are the part of the UI that handle things that are specific to that handler, and the layouts are everything else. You can basically think of a layout as like the site header and footer part of your website, or if you're familiar with CMS tools like coldbox, layouts might be similar to the theme, things like that wrap around your page content before it's rendered in the web browser. So this is our view for our users list page, and our layout is up here, main.cfm. You can see up here at the top of main.cfm is a lot of the header stuff you'd have in a typical website. Your HTML head section, the body tag, your navigation section. Down here at the bottom of that same main.cfm layout file, you can see we have things that would go in the site footer portion of your website, the footer tags, your JavaScript tags, closing body and closing HTML tags, and so on. By default, views go in the views folder, or more specifically, they go in subfolders underneath the views folder. They follow the same naming convention that your handlers do. So if the handler users.list is your users CFC and the list function inside it, the corresponding view for that is going to be in your views folder. There will be a users subfolder underneath views, and inside there will be a list.cfm file. Just like you have your users handler with a list action in it, you have users down here and a list inside that. That's your view for the users list by default. Same naming convention that your handlers have. You can override that and change it if you want. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. By default, coldbox will use the main.cfm layout file. Layout files live in your layouts folder up here. Layouts, on the left-hand side you can see that. And here is our main.cfm layout file. Scroll back to the top so you can see what that looks like up there. You might think that the layout for your users list section of the website might be called users or list, or have a similar folder convention inside the layouts section here. Remember, layouts work for the entire website, not just specific pages or specific handlers. So the layouts need to be more generic in nature than your views do, but you can override that and customize their functionality if you really need to. We'll get into that more in a later video. For the most part, you'll typically have one or two, maybe a couple of layouts in your application. It really depends on the size of your app, how complex it is, and how many different types of overall site navigation you have for the different sections of your website. And even if you have a website with several different types of navigation, you could still get away with maybe using one layout and combine it with some CF includes or some if-else logic here in your layout to toggle different sections of the nav on and off, depending on what kind of user is logged in. There are several different ways you can handle variations of your layout if you don't want to do multiple layouts here in your layout folder. We'll show you some different techniques you can use and features in coldbox to take care of customizing your layouts later on in this video series. Now let's take a look at what the results of our layout and view file look like in the browser. So I'm just going to go back to the same users list page we've been demoing so far. Here's our users list output, and here's our details output. If I click on a user, I can go to the details page, click back to our list page. Here's the list view page, and you can see that there's no business logic in here. There's no if statements, no CF queries, no giant switch case statements with different business logic kind of functionality in here. This entire file is just outputting basically HTML to the screen for us. All of the business logic is of course handled in our handler before it gets to the view, and it outputs everything for us here. But also notice at the top of this file there's no header HTML stuff like the head tag or a body tag, no site navigation. At the bottom of the file there's also no footer tag, no closing HTML or body tag. Again, that's all handled in our layout, and our view is just the portion basically in the middle of our website, from this Vandelay Industries at the top down to about the bottom of that set of list items that I've got highlighted here on my screen That's your view, and everything that's not highlighted is your layout. Let's go back here and take a look at the other side of that. Here's our layout file, and you can see this has the exact opposite in it from our view. It's got basically your site header stuff at the top, our opening HTML and head tags. We're including some style sheets. It's got all of our top level site navigation like we see here, the home and that gray stripe across the top with our menu items over here in the upper right. Scrolling down a bit, you can also see it's got our footer tag in here with all of our footer information in it and all of our JavaScript files that get included as well. So basically all of this portion of the website is also provided by our layout. You might also notice that in our view, we're not doing any sort of CF include to get that main.cfm in here. We're not doing a custom tag or CF module or anything. The list doesn't care what layout file does by itself. It doesn't care which layout file we're using. It doesn't care how that layout file gets executed or compiled. All the view has to take care of is the stuff specific to this view. The layout will be its own separate thing, and coldbox will take care of combining both of those for us behind the scenes. Here's a UML diagram that sort of describes how some of the fundamental pieces of coldbox get connected together. We're going to walk through this real quick and you can see a little bit more about how the layout and view fit into the coldbox system when things happen in your application. Up here is framework supertype, and that's sort of one of the core objects that contains a lot of the fundamental functionality of your coldbox application. A lot of the functions we'll call in our views and our handlers, things that are being provided for us by coldbox. Those come from the framework supertype or things inside or connected to the framework supertype for us. As you can see, framework supertype is how we get our core controller functionality plus things like the flash scope functionality, and that works. We haven't talked about the flash scope yet in these videos, but we will later. We've talked a little bit about cachebox and wirebox. You also get your logging mechanisms from the framework supertype. Down below here we have interceptors, renderers, and your event handlers. That's our event handlers like our users CFC that we've been using so far in the videos. Renderer handles the rendering portion of your website. So the things that actually get outputted to the screen, your layouts and your views, are handled by the renderer. You'll notice that render is also connected to your event RC and PRC scopes. Those are the things that are available to you in your event handler and your layouts and your views. So that all gets basically processed up by the renderer. As the renderer does its job, it takes all of the layouts and views that are being used for whatever the event is that you're currently executing in your application. It will take the layout, that's the site header and footer portion of things. It'll take the view, which is that middle piece of your website that we talked about earlier. The renderer will combine both of those two together and basically get all of the rendering done. So it will actually execute your layout file, produce whatever HTML is produced by that. It will execute your view file and produce whatever HTML output is created by that file. It'll combine the two together so you have the entire contents of your actual web page being created, and that's what creates the output like we have here, our entire site header and footer and everything in between. That's all handled for us by this renderer object. You won't have to actually deal with the renderer object directly. You'll just deal with your layouts and views for the most part in your coldbox development. It's nice to know where these features come from so you can look under the hood and get a little bit better understanding of how things happen in your application, especially when you want to get into more advanced features in coldbox functionality. That render object we just talked about is what we call a transient object. What that means is coldbox will create a new instance of the renderer for you every time your coldbox application processes a new event in your app. So if you click the user list page, you'll get a new render object. You click it 10 more times, you'll get 10 more instances of that render object. The reason it does that is to avoid variable collisions. If we had the same renderer for multiple requests in your application, if two of those requests had variables with the same names in them, say two forms that both have an email address field in them, the renderer might get the data confused and you'd have a variable collision. So to avoid that, you get a new renderer for every page request in your application. As I mentioned briefly earlier, you've got HTML helper, event RC, and PRC that are all available to you because of the renderer. They all get basically included in the renderer as it's working on creating your layouts and views for you. And that's why you can use the RC, PRC, and event scopes in all of your layout and view files, because the renderer takes care of sort of gluing that all together for you as your application runs. In addition to your event RC and PRC scopes, you get several other properties courtesy of the renderer object. that are also available to you in any of the layouts or views in your application. You can get access to Cachebox, controllers, the Flash scope, Logbox, which is the logging mechanism, Wirebox, which is our aspect-oriented programming and dependency injection library, and a few other things. Those all get handled for you by this render object behind the scenes from coldbox. All of this happens magically for you anytime coldbox compiles one of your new events for you. When it takes the event handler, executes the code, produces your layout, produces your view, the renderer takes care of gluing those pieces together for you, making sure your RC and PRC scopes are available in your layouts and your views, and so on. More info about layouts and views can be found in the Orders Books documentation, as well as in the coldbox API documentation. And unless you're building an app that's just an API, you'll get lots of experience with views and layouts regularly as you use coldbox.